Rain pounds a battlefield buried under fallen knights, where two badly wounded swordsmen are still clinging to life. The dark-haired fighter staggers through the wreckage and begs his partner not to die. But his own strength is already disappearing as he orders himself to stay conscious and keep his eyes open. A healing potion might save him, yet no one answers his desperate cries for help, leaving him face down in the blood as he calls for Kai and tries to locate his missing companion. Somewhere nearby, another fading voice calls back for Lambda, while the dark-haired man can only wonder why nobody is coming and what became of them all. This is the story of one complete fool who devoted his entire life to the sword, and the equally stubborn idiot who supported him, even as their promise to save the world dies with them. One lived for nothing but the blade. The other stood behind him, and neither can accept that the other is gone. Their final moments close on one warrior carrying his fallen friend through the rain, beginning the tale of two men who died before ever seeing their dreams come true. Far from that ruined battlefield lies the Leonias territory on the eastern frontier of the Segesta Empire, where the grand residence of frontier Count Leonias overlooks a peaceful estate that seems worlds away from war. Inside, however, one furious gambler is turning a friendly game into a full-scale family crisis, boasting that he is on a roll while the younger man at the table politely prepares to take his money. A worried elder urges the old lord to quit before he loses too much, only for the gambler to roar that he still has savings, as if that makes the situation remotely better. The younger man calmly asks whether he means the money reserved for his granddaughter, instantly exposing just how terrible this plan is. Head Chamberlain Iota finally arrives and demands to know why the lot of them are raising such a racket, then catches the frontier household gambling again and scolds the old man for disgracing the Count's position. With the Count due home soon, Iota orders everyone to keep their recreation under control, while the cheerful young servant running the game, Alpha, invites the crowd to place its final bets. He hides the winning prize beneath one of three little boxes and warns everyone not to look away, whipping them around so quickly that even confident spectators struggle to follow his hands. The boxes dart and cross across the table, but the old gambler refuses to blink because losing again would wipe out what little he has left. Iota watches from behind with a calculating smile, noticing that Alpha secretly swaps boxes in his hands during the shuffle before setting them back down. Still grinning, Alpha keeps the rhythm going, then plants all three boxes in a neat row and lets the suspense do the heavy lifting. He asks where everyone's confidence and money will land, and the desperate old man finally chooses, despite fearing this is another trap. Iota cannot predict the answer either, because Alpha's hand coordination is honestly kind of busted, while the dealer's tiny smile suggests he already knows exactly how this round ends. One spectator claims to have spotted the trick, prompting two piles of coins to slam onto the middle choice and turning the table instantly chaotic. The old man bets everything on that middle beats box, certain he tracked the prize, only for another player to wager that if the geezer chose the center, the winner must be hiding under either outside box. His friend warns that luck has completely abandoned him and calls that counterbet absurd, but the man doubles down anyway and accepts the gamble without hesitation. Iota calmly calculates the payout. Even after two losses, a third correct guess would return 16 coins. So the challenger treats the reckless spread as insurance and waits for Alpha to settle the table. With every stake locked in, the last unchosen box will decide who walks away with the pile, and the old gambler can do nothing except plead with fate, while Alpha announces that betting is closed. He keeps begging as the dealer reaches forward, but Alpha suddenly declares the middle box and flips it open with enough swagger to stop the whole crowd cold. Even Iota is stunned by the result, while the old man launches into a victory celebration and the player who covered the outside choices collapses in defeat. The winner admits his wife nearly killed him over his gambling before, and the losing challenger can only mutter that he messed up as the excitement finally dies down. His friends congratulate the old man and accept the outcome. Then Iota waves everyone back to work before the returning master catches this unauthorized casino in his yard. Alpha quietly slips the winner a little extra for an apple, earning sincere praise for looking after the older servants even while cleaning them out at the table. As Alpha and Iota walk away together, the Chamberlain asks whether Alpha had actually intended for the old man to lose before changing the winning box. Alpha points out that Iota saw through the swap, then playfully shushes him, confirming that the entire last-second reversal was very much deliberate. Alpha runs off before the Chamberlain can press him, leaving Iota baffled over when the impossible second switch could have happened. The young servant returns to sweeping the stables and finally introduces himself properly. To everyone in this world, his name is Alpha, a Leonias household servant. His real identity, however, is Shiba Toei, a legendary underground gambler once called the God of Pestilence, who lived for money, women, alcohol, and high-stakes thrills. Winning too much earned him enemies on every side, and that glamorous run ended pathetically in a rainy back alley, after which he opened his eyes in this quiet frontier world with a new body and a second life. The primitive civilization initially shocked him. No phones, towers, or traffic, plus a home planted in the middle of nowhere. And although the Lord's mansion looks grand, most residents survive through farming, forestry, and mining. Alpha now spends his days sweeping yards and doing endless chores, a brutal downgrade from running casino tables, until word spreads that the master has returned and every servant rushes to receive him. A mounted column approaches the estate in disciplined formation, led by frontier Count Sigma Leonius, a striking swordsman whose arrival makes the entire household snap to attention. Sigma is celebrated as one of the Empire's greatest blades, and the military prestige of his house is strong enough to keep the frontier's rival clans in line. He personally leads troops from the heart of every battle and repeatedly turns danger into opportunity, building a reputation that leaves enemies wounded and his own soldiers fiercely loyal. Even when campaigns descend into chaos, Sigma remains the unmistakable center of the charge, while his guards treat protecting the Count as the highest responsibility in the territory. Yet for all that battlefield competence, Sigma mostly dumps civilian authority and daily management onto his subordinates, making him a legendary sword fanatic to Alpha, who is far too low ranked to have ever spoken with him. That changes when a superior orders Alpha to place the master's horse in the stable, and the servant bows deeply before approaching the exhausted animal with careful respect. Sigma silently watches him from the side, which sends Alpha's danger radar screaming even as he tries to act casual around the horse. The animal immediately presses close and nuzzles him, forcing Alpha to wrestle gently with its reins while asking it to stop messing around. Other servants laugh that even the noble horse has taken a liking to him and probably considers him another underling. While Sigma studies the strange bond without offering a single word, when an attendant asks whether the Count wants his belongings carried inside, Sigma simply refuses, and Alpha returns to work, privately admitting that this modest life suits him far better than expected. The gambling world once supplied its endless stimulation, but it was also built on deception, betrayal, and fraud, whereas Alpha now survives through honest chores among people who treat him with uncomplicated kindness. Each ordinary day brings a meal, decent company, and small pockets of happiness he never had before, making him suspect that a quiet support role might not be such a terrible second life build after all. He keeps cleaning until another servant comes looking for him, relaying an order to finish a job for the old man before dinner, which Alpha accepts without complaint. A moment later, he is scrambling up the side of a building, hauling himself onto the roof and declaring the climb finished as the next chore begins. The job gives Alpha a private place to open the ornate book that arrived with him after Reincarnation, and although serious reading is wildly outside his usual skill tree, he forces himself to study it. The volume is titled History of the Empire's Rise and Fall, a priceless record covering all 3 centuries from the Sylvesta Empire's foundation to its eventual collapse. Its pages trace imperial bloodlines, noble houses, borders, neighboring nations, and enough cultural detail for Alpha to understand this world. But the part that matters most predicts an invasion that will erase the country in only 3 years. This is no ordinary history book. It records events that have not happened yet, including Sigma surrendering his title and territory to his uncle before entering the Imperial Army as a common knight. Sigma will become the continent's strongest swordsman, only for an enemy nation to demand his life during ceasefire negotiations, after which the Empire will be invaded again and completely destroyed. Alpha understands the sequence all too well, realizing politicians sacrifice the man they cannot defeat in battle, only to doom the country that hands him over. This peaceful life now has a 3-year expiration date, so Alpha considers escaping to another nation before everything burns, until the pounding of relentless sword practice drags his attention back to the yard below. Sigma is still hacking apart training equipment with absurd force, repeating the same routine he has followed from early morning until night after already returning from a long campaign. Alpha has to admit the man is a genuine sword nut down to the core, and wonders how many years of brutal repetition forged that strength while he himself has lived only 15. The future champion is already pushing his body and blade beyond ordinary limits, treating peace as preparation for the next battlefield because Sigma's entire life is dedicated to becoming the strongest swordsman alive. Watching from above, Alpha finally calls down that even the master is trained enough for one day, and Sigma ends the final swing before calmly sheathing his weapon. Night settles over the mansion, where Alpha helps the kitchen staff by delivering chopped onions as they prepare an unusually elaborate dinner. A maid explains that the feast is for a guest, and the name Lord Mito immediately tells Alpha that something serious is about to go down. He spots Iota hurrying through the corridor and wonders why the Chamberlain looks so tense, then edges toward a formal meeting room and listens from outside the door. Iota is explaining that cold weather crop failures caused most of the family's financial trouble, insisting the disaster has nothing to do with Sigma's weak management skills. The real problem is the Silotho mine, a weatherproof source of revenue that Sigma previously handed to Lord Mito, his uncle, who lounges like the nobility's least useful housecat and mocks his sword-obsessed nephew for delegating family affairs. When Iota talks back, Mito explodes at the commoner, forcing the head chamberlain to swallow his anger while Sigma quietly watches. Sigma orders Iota to stand down so his uncle can continue his supposed apology, while Alpha recognizes Mito as the previous family head's younger brother, a parasite who avoided war and lives off Leonius wealth. Mito blames Sigma's neglect for making even a chamberlain insolent. though Alpha knows the loudest person acting up in that room is absolutely the uncle. Sigma returns to the actual crisis and admits the cold harvest leaves him struggling to raise capital, but Mito calls him immature and suggests collecting the usual taxes regardless of the failed crops. Sigma refuses because that would starve his own residents. Mito bluntly says taxes belong to the Lord and peasants dying is not his problem. The Count warns that governing people is not so simple, and Alpha silently fumes that this leech has never managed a territory in his life. Mito dismisses Sigma as an ignorant youngster and steers them back to business, offering a loan while promising that future growth will make its harsh terms look like a golden opportunity. Sigma studies the proposal in silence, as his uncle sweetens the pitch by claiming he only wants a share of future profit instead of immediate capital. From the doorway, Alpha catches the unmistakable smell of a scam, because a loan inside the Leonius family makes little sense when Mito's funds probably came from the house to begin with. Iota notices the eavesdropper and demands to know how he dares intrude, then hurriedly apologizes to Mito while trying to explain that Alpha is only a servant. The uncle refuses to tolerate a commoner interrupting nobles and orders Sigma to cut him down, warning that sparing the boy would insult both Mito and the financial help Sigma still needs. He glares at Alpha and promises never to forget the offense, leaving the servant terrified that noble pride will force Sigma to keep the execution order once spoken. Sigma releases a tired breath, then turns back toward his uncle rather than drawing the sword Alpha expects. He accepts the loan and bows, asking Mito to forgive his servant's insolence, while the delighted uncle produces a contract for 2,000 gold coins and claims Sigma finally understands his place. Iota worries the enormous debt could bury the household for years if another harvest fails, but Mito presents it as guaranteed money from his import business and directs Sigma to sign. Alpha recognizes the sales pitch as classic investment bait, the same language every profit scammer uses before taking the mark, and smacks his own head as the full trap clicks into place. The loan is only the visible tip of a much larger scheme, with the territory itself waiting beneath the surface as collateral. Yet, Sigma lowers his pen and signs before anyone can stop him. Mito bursts into laughter, already imagining his nephew trapped for the next decade, until Alpha charges into the room and shouts that the deal cannot happen. He waives the investment contract and declares it nothing more than a rigged gamble, prompting Mito to demand the identity of this reckless servant. Sigma looks equally surprised, while Alpha rushes toward the table despite knowing he has just crossed every social line in the mansion. Even so, staying quiet would only push his master deeper into the trap, and just as he commits to interfering, blue light suddenly erupts around him. A translucent interface fills his vision, identifying itself as the bet chip system and presenting Alpha with a gambling mission. The objective is simple but ridiculous: void the loan agreement by making a wager, which leaves Alpha wondering what kind of Isekai nonsense just activated at the worst possible moment. The system waits for his response, repeating the mission to nullify the contract and asking one decisive question: what will he wager? Time seems to freeze around Alpha as the interface separates him from everyone in the room, and a cluster of glowing chips confirms that this bet chip system is very real. It offers rewards for staking different body parts, leaving Alpha to wonder whether his new cheat seriously expects him to gamble flesh just to activate. His head is priceless and his dignity rules out another option, so the elimination process leaves one remotely acceptable choice: his left arm. Alpha loudly wagers the limb, and the system stamps every listed condition as a win before accepting his selection. Glowing chains coil around the chosen arm, burning the stake into place with blue energy while Alpha braces through the pain. The mission officially begins, and the system's binding contract assures him he only needs to cancel the loan through a genuine game of chance. Back in normal time, Mito demands an explanation for the interruption, while Sigma calmly asks whether his uncle's promissory note might not be enough to complete the deal. Mito takes the question as an insult to his integrity, so Alpha drops to the floor and offers an exaggerated apology before the argument can get his master hurt. He admits he failed to understand Sigma's frustration and claims the shouting simply burst out, prompting both Sigma and Iota to stare as Mito asks what this servant thinks he is doing. Alpha pivots into business talk, arguing that every investment carries risk and the recipient should negotiate returns instead of blindly accepting terms, a surprisingly sharp point from a supposed commoner who has no formal reason to understand finance. He questions whether Mito's promised success and projected profits are truly substantial enough to justify the contract, then frames the entire arrangement as a gamble dressed up to look perfectly safe. Mito scoffs that any serious businessman would recognize a profitable opportunity, but Alpha insists Sigma should not sign until both sides test the confidence behind those claims. The uncle pauses, confused by the challenge, as Alpha warns that even honest effort cannot prevent changing conditions from destroying an investment later. Mito could always deny responsibility and use his power to crush objections, but Alpha calls Sigma too straightforward to play that game, leaving the Count visibly unsure where this servant's increasingly dangerous speech is headed. Alpha finally offers his left arm as collateral and proposes settling the disputed loan through a wager, which makes Iota demand to know whether the boy has completely lost his mind. Nobody stops Alpha from arranging the game, and he places 5 identical red-topped boxes in a row across the black table. Mido watches with smug interest, while Sigma remains silent and lets his servant explain the terms. One box contains a copper coin, and although the original game uses 10 boxes, Alpha cuts the field to 5 to make the odds look almost insultingly generous. The uncle only needs to avoid the single empty trap among the choices, meaning his chance of failing twice is tiny and his apparent chance of victory sits at 96%. Alpha will shuffle the boxes, Mido will choose, and 2 winning selections will preserve the contract, so the noble dismisses the contest as trivial entertainment. With 96% odds, Mido sees no meaningful risk at all, while Alpha confirms that 2 successful picks earn the uncle his win. Failure means the loan disappears, but victory lets Mido order Alpha's left arm severed. A brutal punishment the noble imagines will make everyone fear and admire him. Alpha suddenly realizes this plan sounds much less clever now that an actual sword is nearby, and Sigma coolly confirms that he will cut the limb himself if that is the servant's wager. Alpha had really hoped his master would stop this suicidal nonsense. Yet Mido calls defeat impossible and magnanimously promises mercy if the impossible somehow occurs. The terms are accepted, and they agree to play 1 round at a time while the room closes around the table. Alpha launches into another rapid shuffle, but Iota immediately notices the same hand swap from the earlier courtyard game. The servant spreads his hands and invites Mido to choose, while the noble trusts the overwhelming odds and assumes even bad luck cannot survive 2 rounds. He points to one box, then orders Alpha to open it as every witness holds their breath. The lid slides back, and Mido loses despite a choice that should have succeeded 8 or 9 times out of 10. Alpha smoothly calls for another round, placing the revealed losing box back in the line before the uncle can recover. His hands explode into motion again, and Iota catches a second swap but cannot tell whether Mido has seen it too. Alpha presents the row for the final choice, while Mido studies the dealer's unnatural right-hand movement and confidently reconstructs the trick. Iota reaches the same conclusion, because the simple boxes make the suspicious transfer far easier to track than Alpha seems to realize. Mido deliberately selects the far left box, safely away from where the dud began, and lifts it with the certainty of a man who believes he just beat the cheater at his own game. For the first time, Alpha looks gently tense, yet he calmly asks the noble to open his chosen box. Mido flips the lid, only to find the empty compartment again and scream that the result is impossible. Alpha offers a merciless little smile and calls it a pity, while Mido stares at the box as though probability itself has personally betrayed him. The system confirms Alpha's arm is safe, and the loan agreement has been cancelled. But before anyone can leave, Mido abruptly demands one more round. He claims the first attempt should not count because his choice was random, instantly putting Alpha back on alert. Iota protests that changing the agreement is completely absurd, though Mido argues that mere luck leaves a bad taste and proposes raising the stakes for a third contest. The uncle's confidence returns with a predatory grin, while Alpha measures the new danger and refuses to let his nerves show. Sigma watches without interfering, as Mido makes one condition non-negotiable. Alpha's left arm must remain the wager. Alpha accepts and begins the third round, again presenting 4 winning boxes among 5 choices, with one dud supposedly waiting to punish the wrong selection. His hands blur across the table, but this time every movement is part of a psychological attack rather than a simple speed trick. Alpha admits that testing Mido's luck directly would be foolish, so he has spent each prior round steering the noble toward the dud, placing it near the right side first and using Mido's assumptions to make that position feel safest. On the second round, he forced the uncle to overcorrect after 2 suspicious results on the far right, then planted the apparent danger on the far left, narrowing Mido's future choices through pure manipulation. The final shuffle ends, and Alpha invites his opponent to choose one last time. Mido suspects the center is too obvious, while both far edges feel equally staged and therefore dangerous. That leaves the second or fourth positions looking safest, but he hesitates over which layer of the bluff Alpha prepared, spiraling deeper into the trap with every extra second, he thinks. Unable to decide, Mido asks Sigma where the losing box is, shocking Alpha and Iota with the shameless request. The uncle insists a count who merely watched should be able to answer and pressures Sigma to speak, but the swordsman gives away nothing. After studying the row, Sigma identifies the third box from the right as the dud, while Iota silently waits to see how Mido uses that judgment. Mido claims he knew it, because that was exactly the box Alpha wanted him to pick, then grabs a different choice and gloats that the servant's elaborate setup has failed. He raises the box while threatening to collect Alpha's arm and orders the dealer to reveal the result. Alpha answers with a dark little grin and invites him to go ahead, so Mido tears the lid open, only to find another dud and recoil as though the box itself just attacked him. Iota cannot believe the third failure, because missing all 3 rounds should occur only once in roughly 125 attempts. Alpha celebrates an absurd streak of misfortune, unlike anything even he witnessed in professional gambling, joking that a personal storm cloud must be concentrated over Mido and his time management business. The uncle stares at his own hand, unable to understand why it keeps selecting losing boxes, while Sigma quietly considers the result. He then asks Mido to reconsider the loan and protect the territory instead, cutting off his uncle's furious objection with the authority of the household head. Sigma says continuing after 3 defeats would be dishonorable and requests a repayment plan that preserves his people's livelihoods. leaving Mido to stammer that this outcome cannot be real. The disastrous meeting breaks apart, and afterward, Oda asks where Alpha learned sleight of hand capable of fooling both nobles. Alpha answers that Sigma and Mido actually guessed his movements correctly, which means the game was cheating from the start, because only one of the five boxes ever contained a copper coin. The apparent winning sounds came from a coin Alpha carried between the boxes, hidden against his hand so he could make any empty container seem loaded. Even a hollow box rattled whenever he shook it with his left hand, the same basic misdirection used in countless street cons. Iota calculates that Mido still had nearly a 98% chance after 3 tries and feels almost sorry for him. But Alpha explains the real point was ensuring the uncle never selected the sole genuine winner. The Chamberlain finally understands. As Alpha reveals, he placed the coin farthest from Mido in round 1 for the safest opening. He shifted it to the opposite edge in round 2, then risked the far left position again for the third, making Iota demand where a servant learned tactics this cunning. Alpha laughs it off and reminds him that plenty of years and today's courtyard game went into the technique, though he insists cheating is reserved for moments when an honest result would make someone suffer. A friendly guessing game would be pointless if he rigged it every time. So Iota calls him a truly slippery fellow and sends him back to his quarters. Alpha turns to leave, but Sigma stops him with a quiet call from across the room. The Count thanks Alpha for saving the household from the loan, stunning the servant who expected punishment rather than gratitude. Alpha awkwardly says he is welcome, then retreats down the corridor, amazed that the Lord personally acknowledged someone of his rank. The moment leaves him grinning, because even slightly changing Sigma's doomed future feels surprisingly good. He continues toward his room when the blue interface abruptly erupts in front of him again. Alpha jumps backward, staring as a pale chip materializes beside the completed mission display. The system awards him 80 initial chips, confirming the currency that will power every future gamble. Alpha realizes staking his arm earned the large payout and feels relieved that the reckless bet ended cleanly, until the rules explain that he must wager chips on missions, and hitting 0 means death. Earned chips can increase his total or purchase rewards, making the lethal downside alarming, even as the potential upgrades catch his gambler's attention. A reward menu offers appraisals, perception, sword skills, roulette, and other system abilities for different prices. And Alpha's curiosity starts winning the argument for his common sense can even sit down. The reward screen is getting dangerously interesting, but the next morning drags Alpha back into ordinary servant life before he can explore it properly. He hauls a cart overflowing with vegetables and immediately feels his entire body protesting, having stayed awake for hours poking at the bet chip system instead of sleeping. The interface still tempts him whenever he glances aside because abilities unlock when his chip total reaches certain thresholds, while special items come through a separate lottery. He finally passed out only after studying every menu, and now wonders which rewards will prove useful while finishing his morning delivery. Another servant calls him to head Chamberlain Iota's office, where a formal uniform is already waiting beside the desk. Alpha worries he is being assigned permanent attendance near the master, but Iota confirms he will keep his stable duties while accompanying Sigma whenever the Count requires service. Alpha accepts the promotion, and Iota tells him to change out of his dirty work clothes before reporting for the new job. Soon he crosses the estate's enormous training grounds, where armed men are drilling beneath a swordsman's unforgiving supervision. Alpha is handed a practice blade and wonders why a personal attendant needs sword training, until Knight Visconti identifies him as Sigma's new servant and says the Lord ordered proper instruction. The Knight asks whether Alpha plans to merely watch his master train, then promises direct lessons in orthodox swordsmanship, turning the promotion into an unexpected boot camp. Visconti corrects Alpha's feet, posture, and grip, demonstrating a balanced stance that the inexperienced servant awkwardly tries to copy. The first exchange sends Alpha crashing to the ground, leaving both hands scraped and making him ask whether this punishment really happens every day. He was planning to escape before the predicted war and has 0 time to become trapped in daily night training. But Visconti sweeps aside the next recruit with equally brutal efficiency. The defeated man gives up, and Sigma immediately calls for the next challenger as if exhaustion is a myth invented by weaker builds. Alpha watches a whole line of trainees waiting for their turn, wondering what these sword fanatics are doing to themselves before returning to his real assignment. He departs the estate beside Iota in Sigma's carriage, and the Chamberlain explains that Alpha must accompany the Lord and observe administrative duties. Their first trip is an inspection of crop conditions across the domain, bringing Alpha into a struggling farming peasant surrounded by fields. Iota explains that last year's cold spell devastated local agriculture, reducing the harvest to less than half its normal yield. Many residents can barely secure enough food each day, while flour and fettuccine prices have soared so badly that some families reportedly sold their children just to survive. Alpha falls silent, remembering that whenever food runs short, the weakest people are always sacrificed first. Poverty once left him scavenging alone in filthy alleys, proof that selfish adults can push children into misery in any world. He remembers collapsing from hunger, too weak to do more than search refuse for something edible. the old pain still feels close, because eras and worlds change, but desperate people keep suffering in exactly the same ways. Iota notices his expression and asks what is wrong. So Alpha reasons that a harvest below half must have destroyed tax revenue along with the household finances. The Chamberlain starts to correct him, revealing that Sigma collected no taxes at all from his struggling residents. Alpha calls that policy ridiculous, since the estate still owes imperial taxes and costly tribute to defend the frontier from raiders. Iota explains that Sigma covered every obligation from his own fortune last year, driving the Leonius household toward bankruptcy. While Alpha asks why the Count did not simply collect from the people or seek an exemption, Sigma's answer is painfully sincere. The residents are his family, and helping suffering family members is the most natural duty he can imagine. That belief stops Alpha cold, because he never expected a noble lord to value common lives above his personal wealth. Even ordinary parents abandon their children under pressure. Yet Iota says both he and Alpha belong to Sigma's family and must repay that loyalty through faithful service. Alpha watches the Count move toward the next problem, quietly repeating the unfamiliar word family to himself. Sigma looks back as shouting rises nearby, where a merchant caravan has attracted desperate villagers and brought far too little stock. Iota asks what caused the commotion, and a smug trader explains that shortages forced him to sell limited flour and other necessities at triple price. The wagons are loaded with valuable goods, but a young woman still begs for affordable medicine for her sick father. The merchant mocks her tears and refuses to give any discount, until Iota steps forward and demands his attention. The Chamberlain condemns the company for exploiting residents with spring prices meant for winter scarcity, but the trader hides behind Lord Mido's exclusive license to import and sell essential goods in the frontier. He claims the dangerous journey makes procurement expensive, so Iota suggests the Leonius house buy the merchandise directly and handle distribution itself. The proposal rattles the merchant, though he quickly sneers that anyone who dislikes his prices is to find another supplier. Promising to return in 5 days, he tells the villagers to savor what happens when they cannot obtain necessities, then rolls away with his caravan while Alpha fumes at the man's arrogance. Iota restrains him and explains that the company belongs to Lord Mido, leaving Alpha with the real problem. The nearly bankrupt Leonius house needs capital before those merchants return. That night, Alpha races through the darkened estate, hunting for any overlooked resource that could become the territory's emergency bankroll. He swears the merchant will regret squeezing those desperate villagers, and 5 days later the same caravan rolls confidently back into town. Its owner assumes the peasants learned their lesson and will buy at whatever price he sets, so he gleefully plans to gouge them even harder. The villagers gather around the wagon, where the merchant orders everyone into line and displays his supposedly precious stock. His first price sends the crowd into despair, because even a handful of silver can barely secure Tedison while food costs continue climbing. When the young woman cannot pay, the merchant offers to introduce her to profitable night work, then places a hand on her shoulder as though poverty has erased her right to refuse. A grand Leonius carriage suddenly appears, and Alpha leans out waving while Iota brings the convoy straight into the village square. The residents turn toward the commotion as the Chamberlain unloads crate after crate and apologizes for keeping everyone waiting. Flour, medicine, cotton, salt, and other essentials are handed out in generous amounts, with Iota announcing that every item is free to the people who need it. The merchant charges over and demands to know what Alpha is doing, nearly choking when he hears that the entire shipment costs the villagers nothing. Alpha explains that the Leonius house procured its own supplies exactly as the trader suggested, which makes the man ask where a nearly bankrupt Margrave found enough money. Alpha answers with a smile that belongs on a casino shark, because 5 days earlier he had already decided that solving this crisis required startup capital instead of another argument with Mido. He summoned the system and searched its rewards for a tool, letting the blue interface scan possibilities around him. One upgrade finally stood out, so Alpha spent 5 chips to unlock item appraisal. The system installed the active skill immediately, and Alpha figured even a broke noble estate might hide 1 or 2 forgotten treasures in storage. He searched that night, but elegant corridors and empty rooms produced absolutely nothing valuable enough to sell. Alpha had hoped for jewelry, accessories, or buried coin, yet every door only led to another disappointing space. The Count's family was too practical to fill its home with decorative wealth, and Alpha was ready to quit when a filthy old hide in a storeroom caught his eye. Item appraisal marked it, identifying the ragged scrap as a valuable demonic boar pelt rather than worthless trash. Its quality and market data appeared beside it, revealing that the disgusting hide alone could sell for 30 gold coins. Alpha snapped fully awake, and suddenly the storage room lit up with valuable labels attached to monster materials everywhere. He scanned piles of hides, bones, horns, and other forgotten trophies, realizing that materials treated as rare loot in games were ordinary frontier clutter here. Dangerous monsters roam the country's outer lands, where their meat is eaten but tough hides and parts are often discarded, even though skilled processing can turn them into clothing and luxury goods coveted by nobles. In the imperial capital, merchants pay premium prices for those materials and sell the finished products for even more. So Alpha persuades Iota to let the territory convert its neglected monster stock into cash. They load the goods onto carriages and travel overnight, selling the materials in the capital before using the proceeds to purchase essential supplies at fair wholesale prices. Back in the village, the merchant keeps demanding Alpha's funding source, but Alpha calls it a trade secret and leaves him guessing. The trader realizes his monopoly is collapsing, as Alpha announces the Iota Trading Company will now manage Frontier Supply under Sigma's direct authority. The merchant panics over what will happen to his remaining inventory and laments that his entire business is ruined. Alpha warns him never to exploit the villagers again, explaining that sustainable trade makes buyers happy instead of treating misery as a business model. Nobody here is trying to satisfy endless greed, since residents are scraping together the absolute minimum simply to feed families and obtain medicine. The villagers condemn any business that profits by increasing their suffering, while Alpha names the merchant scheme for what it is: extortion. He tells the man not to pretend such abuse deserves the title of trading company, and the defeated profiteer visibly shrinks beneath the crowd's anger. Alpha hands him a proper tax ledger, settles the legitimate amount owed, and makes clear that no further cooperation is needed. While the new Iota Trading Company limits itself to a reasonable commission that still funds future shipments, Alpha laughs at how cleanly the counterplay worked, and other staff notice that their young servant seems suspiciously comfortable running major trade deals. That evening, Iota reports the completed operation to Sigma, confirming that the supply crisis has been brought under control. The Count accepts the news and says he does not care if Mido protests because his uncle's company caused the residents hardship. Sigma praises Iota's work and dismisses him, but the Chamberlain pauses at the door before leaving. He looks back at his seated master, wondering whether Sigma anticipated this result when he appointed Alpha as his personal attendant. The Count calmly returns to his papers, while Iota admits he is hardly devout enough to claim divine revelation. Even so, the thought no longer seems completely foolish, because Sigma says he knew Alpha would never sit back and do nothing when people were suffering. Iota absorbs that unexpected confidence and quietly decides Sigma may have found exactly the kind of person this troubled household needs. Alpha, meanwhile, collapses into bed so exhausted that giving him even more work might actually finish him. Soon he is wandering a forest path beyond the estate, still chewing an apple while thinking through the territory's problems. The Leonia's domain appears to possess almost nothing besides monster materials and farmland. Even if the peaceful orchards and open land look beautiful, selling hides can cover immediate merchant costs, but that temporary fix cannot create lasting prosperity. And without a successor economy, Sigma will still lose the domain before marching toward his predicted death. Alpha decides he must somehow change his master's future. Remembering that he experimented with another system upgrade the previous night, he had 75 chips remaining and wanted to preserve most of them as a bankroll for future missions. Yet one skill looked capable of transforming the territory in a single move. Alpha spent 15 chips on land appraisal instead of a pricier combat ability, gaining the power to read terrain, conditions, resources, and geological formations. He imagines discovering a gold or silver vein worth ridiculous money, then searches every promising patch of forest and hillside. Hours of scanning reveal absolutely nothing, leaving Alpha convinced he burned 15 chips on a useless purchase. Refusing to quit, he crosses to another slope and continues searching, until movement deeper in the forest finally catches his attention. A massive one-eyed wolf is confronting Sigma, its red aura and central eye marking it as no ordinary predator. The beast has driven a frightened young woman in religious clothing against the cliff, and with nowhere left to flee, she clutches a holy symbol and prays. She begs the supreme god Mercury for salvation. As the demonic wolf lowers itself to strike, one huge claw lashes forward, making the trapped pilgrim scream for anyone to help. Sigma crashes between them and catches the attack on his sword, then drives the creature backward with enough force to save her from the first blow. The woman looks up in shock, while Alpha joins from above by swinging down on a branch and yelling at the monster. Its single eye locks onto the new nuisance, exactly as Alpha planned when he challenged the beast not to underestimate humans. He needs one more push to finish the setup, so the system activates his first-level wind spell, Aerial Spin. Air slams into the wounded monster, driving it across the ground and toward the cliff as Alpha keeps his branch raised. The creature disappears over the edge, leaving only a short blood trail behind. Alpha exhales and declares the fight over. Aware the weak spell could never kill that beast directly, but could knock it off balance after Sigma softened it up. He checks whether the rescued woman is injured, only for her to clasp her hands and thank the supreme god Mercury for personally saving her. Alpha points out that an actual human did the saving, then asks why she was wandering a monster-infested mountain dressed like a pilgrim. She continues praising divine intervention with complete confidence, and Alpha jokes that her speech sounds unnatural, as though she is forcing a strange accent. The woman insists her pronunciation is perfect for the region. While Alpha calls her attempt a straight-up regional failure, she turns away in offended silence. then retreats into another cheerful Mercury blessing rather than continue losing the argument. The pilgrim introduces herself as Sheeta and thanks Alpha for saving her, so he gives his own name and says he is glad she is safe. Sheeta notices the scratch on his hand and refuses to ignore it. Despite Alpha insisting it came from nothing more dangerous than a branch. Green light gathers between her palms as she casts Heal, closing the wound instantly and leaving Alpha staring at unbroken skin. He celebrates the result with open amazement, but Sheeta urgently asks him to keep what he witnessed secret. Alpha realizes she means the healing magic and asks why a useful miracle would need hiding. Before she can answer, armored escorts rush in calling for Lady Sheeta, and the entire party is soon received in a formal chamber at the Leonius mansion. Sigma questions why a young pilgrim was permitted to roam Divine Peak Euremia with such inadequate protection, but an elderly archbishop laughs and denies that the journey was poorly guarded. He explains that Sheeta's revolution pilgrimage had stalled for a decade, so he personally wanted to help her visit the region, while urging Sigma to return to the imperial capital because the emperor and ministers miss him. Euremia is the continent's highest mountain and is revered as the holy land where the supreme god Mercury descended, which supposedly justified an archbishop and 5 elite escorts accompanying a single pilgrim. Even that force was ambushed by a pack of demonic wolves and nearly lost the girl, though an escort admits it was their first clash with magical beasts and says he briefly dropped his guard. The archbishop thanks Sigma for protecting Sheeta and offers his sincere gratitude for the inconvenience, while an imperial crested knight frames the escort as ordinary duty to the temple. Iota recognizes that crest as belonging to the Imperial Guard, and finds it deeply unnatural for both a powerful archbishop and palace soldiers to accompany an unknown nun on pilgrimage. He suspects the visit may hide an inspection of the Margrave's domain, but the archbishop keeps smiling and says he is simply grateful that Sigma rescued companions separated during the attack. Sheeta adds that Mercury's presence feels closest on Euremia, attracting pilgrims from across the continent at least once in their lives, while Alpha quietly studies every guest and wonders what this heavily guarded holy traveler really is. The archbishop admits pilgrimages become difficult when believers must risk their lives, since nobody can guarantee a monster-free route, and agrees that trained knights are the only dependable defense. Alpha politely interrupts the discussion, wearing his most innocent servant smile as he asks permission to make a small proposal. Iota instantly recognizes that Alpha has another scheme and warns him not to advertise it on his face, but Alpha announces a plan designed to benefit the church, the territory, and every pilgrim. Leonius will fully support Mercury believers traveling to the Holy Mountain, while the new Iota Trading Company runs regular capital shipments and recruits travelers for organized groups. Each tour can handle roughly 100 pilgrims, with Leonius Knights providing protection against magical beasts for a service fee, plus safe lodging, meals, and a comfortable journey through the domain. Alpha proudly welcomes everyone to the Margrave's new attraction, the so-called absolutely safe Divine Peak Euremia tour. The archbishop did never imagine such an ambitious proposal was possible, while Sheeta and her guards stare at Alpha's shameless sales presentation. Iota looks rather pleased by the idea, and the room settles into serious discussions instead of rejecting it outright. Sigma gives the plan his approval, noting that escorting pilgrims can double as monster surveillance and patrol duty for his knights. The guests quickly warm to the arrangement, especially when Iota promises a 2-day route with meals, trained escorts, and carefully selected paths. Alpha is already calculating extra revenue from food, local specialties, souvenirs, and religious goods, and the Leonius Domain tourist attraction project officially begins. Sheeta calls the household servants unusual. Then night passes as preparations move forward. The next day finds Alpha back in sword training, where another recruit is launched aside before Alpha even gets a chance to breathe. Visconti's practice blow nearly crushes him and is somehow criticized as too light. While the knight warns that missing such an opening in real combat would be fatal, Alpha tightens his grip and keeps going. As Sheeta watches the brutal lesson from beyond the yard, training finally ends, leaving Alpha slumped against the wall and declaring himself completely exhausted. He has been running since morning while also arranging the pilgrimage tour and shopping for supplies, but he refuses to disrespect Visconti by treating the sword lessons casually. Sheeta tells Alpha he always manages to exceed everyone's expectations, then trails off and compares that drive with her own uncertainty. When Alpha asks whether something happened during her pilgrimage, she reveals that she is one of the candidates to become the next saint. A saint is Mercury's most important living messenger, capable of receiving divine grace and performing miracles. And records say only one is born every 100 years. This year marks exactly a century since the previous saint's birth, so candidates were chosen from teenage nuns, an honor that Alpha immediately assumes must delight Sheeta. She explains that her powerful noble family valued lineage above everything, making Alpha realize his cheerful new friend was born a noble daughter. Sheeta was considered the family's failure and sent to the central temple as a baby, a rejection that still follows her beneath the bright pilgrim act. The archbishop has known her since childhood and encouraged her to seek the saint's blessing, telling her that an oracle might descend if she visited the divine peak in person. Sheeta followed his recommendation, climbed to the sacred place, and prayed with everything she had. She begged the supreme god Mercury to answer, but heard no voice at all. Alpha quietly understands the disappointment. As Sheeta admits, she spent years feeling like an existence nobody wanted and hoped even a useless person might be accepted by God. Becoming the saint could have changed her life and made the parents who abandoned her finally welcome her back, perhaps with the warmth she never received as a child. Now she has almost no hope and assumes someone like her was never meant to be chosen. But Alpha refuses to let that conclusion stand. He demands to know why she is satisfied with giving up so easily, startling Sheeta out of her resignation. Alpha says everyone eventually faces a do-or-die moment and only they can decide their fate when it arrives, prompting Sheeta to ask whether he ever faced one himself. He remembers going all in against the strongest enemy of his previous life, with heaven waiting if his cards won, and hell if they lost, because a true gambler always commits the wager. Nobody knows whether their defining chance comes tomorrow or years later, but they only get one opportunity to push luck toward heaven, and winning requires absolute resolve. Sheeta asks what that condition actually is, so Alpha begins with the simplest answer, calling the Ace of Spades the will to bet everything. A person has to seize their own destiny, because only Sheeta can change her future, not some distant god. She stares at him in surprise, while Alpha insists that someone whose life is on the line cannot sit still and wait for divine approval. He proposes climbing Eurymia again before she leaves, then tells her to face Mercury with total confidence and demand to be chosen as the saint. Sheeta bursts into laughter at the outrageous advice before asking what Alpha would do if he lost after wagering his entire life. He answers that he would charge forward with the worst hand imaginable and push every remaining chip into the bet, which makes Sheeta laugh even harder and accuse him of cheating. As they race across the grounds together, Sheeta realizes she has been obsessing over her own problems and chasing sainthood as a rescue, when what she can do for people matters far more than whether anyone officially chooses her. She becomes grateful that fate brought her to the Leonius domain, and a sudden blue radiance surrounds her as a distant voice calls her a child of mercy. The unseen presence begins delivering an oracle about the person destined to guide her. While Sheeta stands frozen and Alpha approaches from across the yard, she wonders whether the divine message truly happened, then barely hears Alpha asking what is wrong. Sheeta stares at him as the oracle's unfinished meaning settles in, and Alpha unknowingly becomes the person she connects with that revelation. The next day, new visitors arrive at the Leonius mansion, where the household once again gathers to receive important guests. Archbishop Costello remains cheerful while Sheeta sits quietly beside him, and Sigma waits at the center of the formal reception. Footsteps thunder through the hall as Mido and an enormous young man rush in after hearing that distinguished people joined the residence. Mido demands to know why nobody informed him, then notices Alpha and immediately recognizes the servant who ruined his loan scheme. Alpha offers an absurdly polite bow and wishes him a good day, trying to look like a harmless attendant even though Mido knows better. He plays the supportive servant role with maximum effort, while the uncle privately considers taking advantage of Alpha's fascinating gambling talent. Sigma asks what brings Mido back, but the arrival of Sheeta, Costello, and their armored escort redirects everyone's attention. Mido introduces himself to Archbishop Costello as Sigma's uncle, pouring on such aggressive flattery that the priest can only smile through it. He boasts of donations to the central temple and claims there is no greater believer in the region, then shamelessly asks the archbishop to remember and reward him personally. Mido even produces gold coins as proof of devotion, making Alpha marvel at a veteran grifter happily scamming while disguised as a respectable noble. Sigma warns his uncle to stop joking around, and Iota reminds Mido that the guests witnessed everything from the beginning. Another booming voice suddenly cries for the archbishop. As Mido's huge son introduces himself as Ioro, Costello calls the newcomer a lively young man, while Mido praises his son as accomplished in both literary and military arts. Iota quietly tells Alpha that this father-son introduction is reaching historic levels of self-promotion, especially when Mido claims Ioro's swordsmanship ranks second only to Sigma, the Empire's famous decapitator. Costello tactfully overlooks the exaggeration, while Alpha and Iota exchange a look over how naturally nobody challenges the boast. Alpha still cannot figure out what Mido really came to request, when the Imperial Guard and Sheeta step forward for formal greetings. Alpha quietly asks whether Sheeta wants to slip away from the increasingly awkward scene, but she says no because she is already fine. Sheeta thanks Alpha by name, leaving him confused about what he supposedly did besides giving blunted advice. She then approaches Mido's group. As Costello instructs her to greet Lord Mido and Lord Aoro, Sheeta obediently agrees. Introducing herself as a nun of the central temple and offering Mercury's blessing to both men, Koro is instantly smitten, grabbing her hand, and declaring that he has received her feelings forever. Mido praises Sheeta's appearance in pure white robes, then pushes his promising son toward her like he is arranging a livestock sale. He announces that Koro will eventually rule the Leonius domain, but first should join the Temple Knights to add prestige to his name. Shocking Sigma, Iota, Costello, Sheeta, and even the Silent Guard. Alpha seethes at the audacity, because Mido has effectively declared a plan to seize the family's inheritance in front of its current lord. Sheeta recoils from the unwanted attention and begins stepping away while the noble keeps talking. Tension sharpens between Sigma and his uncle, as Mido argues that an unmarried warrior could die in battle, making Aoro the natural emergency successor. Iota warns that succession and temple recruitment are inappropriate subjects in front of guests from the capital, So Mido apologizes to Costello and reframes his visit as a request to recommend Ioro for Abominable Knights. The Archbishop explains that Temple Knights are not actually escorting him on this pilgrimage, revealing that the armored commander belongs to the Imperial Guard for unrelated circumstances. Iota immediately senses a hidden motive behind Mido's sudden request, but the uncle interprets the Imperial connection as divine luck opening an even better path for his son. He asks both Archbishop and Commander to recommend Aoro, which would effectively guarantee admission, while the overconfident son thanks them before anyone agrees. Alpha can barely contain his anger at their arrogance when the bet chip system appears and turns the conflict into a new opportunity. A gambling mission orders him to defeat Aoro and asks which event he will enter, confirming that the confrontation itself has triggered the wager. Alpha can choose dice at double odds, a marathon at quadruple odds, or swordsmanship for an eightfold payout, though a servant openly challenging a noble's son would look completely insane. He studies the choices with no obvious safe route, since dice offers the easiest win but the smallest reward, while Aoro's specialty pays 8 times the stake. Alpha initially considers taking the middle ground with a marathon, then realizes the sisters might let him use something far more unfair. Alpha closes the interface and steps back into the reception, where Iota loudly interrupts Mito's demand for automatic admission. The uncle assumes the Chamberlain is about to praise his wonderful proposal, but Alpha eagerly suggests testing Aoro through the Imperial Guard entrance exam immediately. He plays the helpful servant so enthusiastically that Mito has no graceful way to refuse, leaving the uncle furious as the challenge moves outside. The entire household gathers around the training grounds, and available fighters form up for a public examination. Knights and servants crowd the edges, while the Imperial commander announces that Aoro's trial will now begin. Sigma, Costello, Shida, and Iota take their places as witnesses. The examiner explains that Ioro must defeat 3 opponents in a row to pass. His first opponent is none other than Servant Alpha, a choice that makes Visconti and Sigma watch with particular interest. Iota admits he has no idea why Alpha looks so confident, but the supposed beginner steps forward with a smile. Alpha even volunteers to fight first, arguing that every candidate should have their ability tested honestly, while Costello warns that this confrontation may not end peacefully. Alpha says the outcome depends on Mido, because although nobody intends serious harm, Ioro is naturally powerful, properly trained, and built with the kind of physique that overwhelms inexperienced opponents. Iota reminds Alpha that a few days of sword lessons offer almost no chance against him, but Alpha has already staked 20 chips on the swordsmanship match at 8-to-1 odds. Since he also spent 10 chips buying a combat skill, losing would wreck his bankroll and delay every useful reward. So he asks Iota whether any knight present can beat Mido's idiot son. Alpha has a fallback plan. At minimum, he only needs to stop Ioro before all 3 victories are complete, while Iota tells him to prepare carefully for whatever comes next. Mido and Aoro have crossed too many lines to ignore, and Alpha is determined to settle the matter properly. The fighters enter the ring, as Mido wonders why a mere servant was inserted into a noble's admission test and suspects a hidden plot. He dismisses the danger because Alpha's gambling tricks should not work with swords, though he still keeps a final contingency ready in case Aoro somehow loses. The first match begins, and Alpha grips his wooden sword, vowing to struggle for every one of the 20 chips wagered in the God of Misfortune's name. The commander gives the signal, and Aoro charges with an immediate overhead strike. His speed catches Alpha off guard, forcing the servant to block a crushing sequence of blows. The crowd is surprised he can defend at all, while Alpha finally understands what makes his opponent dangerous. Aoro is aggressive and unpredictable but still trained correctly, leaving few exploitable mistakes, so Alpha sees no realistic opening to win through ordinary technique. The noble keeps pounding his guard, and Shida watches Alpha struggle with growing concern. Aoro sweeps around with another heavy attack, driving Alpha backward through repeated blocks. Convinced the servant cannot even counterattack, Aoro grows smug, though Visconti recognizes Alpha's defense is giving him at least a little trouble. Shida quietly believes Alpha will find a way, while Aoro's confidence shifts into confusion when his opponent refuses to fall. Alpha mocks the stronger man for bullying a beginner and calls the performance deeply uncool. Prompting Aoro to claim this entire admission opportunity is happening thanks to him. To prove his superiority, Aoro offers Alpha the first attack, as Shida openly remarks that the noble does not look cool at all. Alpha accepts the invitation, and both fighters square up for one decisive exchange. Aoro imagines himself joining the Imperial Knights and assumes Sigma's servant is merely a solid beginner, but Alpha steps absurdly close as their wooden blades collide. The distance makes Aoro wonder what his opponent is doing, because even a skilled swordsman struggles against a technique never seen before. Alpha identifies his counter as a technique from Japanese kendo, catching everyone around the arena off guard, and silently thanks Aoro for charging straight into the precise opening that makes it possible. His newly purchased first-level sword skill, Rising Disarm, flashes across the system interface, as the crowd roars and both wooden blades finally collide at the center of the ring. Instead of blocking Aoro's tremendous power directly, Alpha redirects the descending slash at an angle, while Visconti recognizes the opportunity and shouts for him to complete the counter, using the giant noble's full commitment and forward momentum against him. Alpha snaps Aoro's sword upward and backward with one perfectly timed movement, The reflected wooden blade smashes squarely into Aoro's own face before he can release it, dropping the massive opponent flat on his back before he even understands what happened. Mito screams that a servant defeating his son this cleanly should be completely impossible, but the presiding commander raises Alpha's arm and officially declares him the winner. Iota, Archbishop Costello, and Sheeta celebrate the upset beside the stunned spectators, while Alpha decides Rising Disarm was easily worth every one of those 10 chips. The skill destroys an opponent's stance by knocking their weapon upward at the instant of contact, and Ioro finally awakens on the ground, confused about why the entire arena is cheering. Desperate to overturn the outcome, Mito accuses a lowborn servant of deliberately injuring a noble, though Alpha maintains that Aero's own redirected strike caused an unfortunate and unavoidable accident. His furious uncle insists Alpha intentionally aimed the reflected weapon at Aero's unprotected face, openly accusing the victorious servant of a calculated attack before every noble and imperial witness. Mito thinks the servant may have blocked Aero's imperial guard path, but refuses to let the humiliation end there. While the assembled trainees trade uneasy looks, he argues that a slightly different impact could have killed his son, making the match attempted murder, then asks Sigma whether Alpha is his personal servant and whether he ordered the attack. Mito intends to use this opening to bring his nephew down as a last resort, but Sigma coolly asks how he plans to assign responsibility for a supervised exam. Every witness closes around the confrontation, and the Imperial Commander Tang states he has no complaint about the match result or examination. Mito ignores that ruling and accuses a commoner of striking his defenseless noble son, while Alpha offers a careful apology beneath the watching crowd. Costello and Sheeta sense the danger, as Mito declares any commoner who commits violence against a noble guilty of a serious crime. Sigma refuses to accept that framing, but his uncle calls the incident rebellion against the social order and claims leniency threatens the entire ruling structure. Mito asks Archbishop Costello to confirm the principle, and the priest reluctantly admits the law can be interpreted that way. Alpha realizes the old parasite found a real legal weapon, while Mito pretends Sigma's hesitation proves the servant matters more to him than justice. Alpha kneels and asks to be punished before his master sacrifices the household for him, drawing alarmed reactions from the watching staff. He offers his own life if that will settle the charge, and Sheeta looks on in helpless concern. Mito says a severe punishment could resolve the noble dispute, though the sweat on his face hints that execution is only bait for a much larger move. Exploiting the Archbishop and Imperial Commander's presence, he formally proposes removing Sigma as Margrave, forcing the Count to face the political attack directly. Costello is shocked by the demand, and the soldiers react as Mito turns a training accident into a coup. He asks the witnesses to support a family petition for imperial judgment, while the commander admits a reported case would be examined under imperial law. Mito claims Sigma is unfit for 2 reasons, beginning with the absence of any capable successor, then repeats his earlier accusation that the Count neglected bookkeeping and administration. He adds crop failure, widespread poverty, and the supposed likelihood that Leonius cannot pay imperial border obligations, before naming himself as the only qualified replacement and demanding the title. Mito invites counter-arguments with complete confidence, and Sigma begins to say that if imperial judgment finds him unfit, he will accept it. The Count is even willing to surrender his qualifications and rebuild from nothing, which makes the commander and assembled troops tense. Several soldiers protest immediately, but Army Vice Commander Claude says Sigma cannot casually take back a lord's sworn word. Sigma insists that rank changes nothing because he pledged to let the winner choose, prompting Mito to ask whether the Archbishop agrees that his nephew has surrendered all hope of retaining the title. The uncle privately celebrates Vigma's rigid honor as the perfect weakness, while Costello says little can be done if stepping down is truly the Lord's own desire. Mito presses for an immediate dismissal petition, but the Archbishop adds that suitability should be decided by the territory's people rather than family claims alone. Mito imagines finally becoming head of the Leonius house, and erupts into victorious laughter before any verdict exists. Alpha asks what could possibly be so funny, as Costello calls for a proper examination of whether Mito is actually suited to govern. Head Chamberlain Iota steps forward on cue, making Mito's confidence wobble. Iota presents records of missing taxes, private gifts, military obligations, and questionable revenue tied to Mito's management, while the uncle orders him to stop speaking. Costello says the evidence should be reviewed in full if everyone wants an honest judgment, and Iota produces the trading company ledger showing essential goods sold to Leonius residents at roughly triple price. Mito lunges at the Chamberlain in fury, but armed men surround him before he can destroy anything. Panic finally replaces his smug performance, as Iota submits the promissory note prepared for Sigma before their rigged loan wager. Mito recognizes the contract he thought had vanished, and reaches desperately toward the papers. He begs them to stop the review, while Costello calmly begins reading the hidden terms. The note clearly states that the Leonius domain would become collateral for Mito's loan, which the Imperial Commander calls a major violation because territorial transfers require Imperial approval and cannot be bought through private deals. The offense is serious enough to strip Mito of noble status, leaving him collapsed under the weight of his own contract. Costello announces that the facts will be formally reported to the Imperial family, then adds one important correction to Mito's accusations. Despite last year's harvest collapse, Sigma paid the empire in full without collecting from his people, proving extraordinary loyalty. So the archbishop recommends that he remain Margrave with the empire's highest trust. The entire household erupts in celebration, and even the watching knights finally relax. Sigma receives the verdict in his usual calm silence, while Aero tries to pull his ruined father back to his feet. Mido is dragged away past the people he tried to exploit, still clinging to the remains of his title. Alpha gives him a cheerful thumbs up and explains that every servant hates his guts. But Mido swears this is not over and promises the brat will still pay. Aero warns Alpha that once he reaches the palace, the servant had better watch his back. But the threat fades as order returns beneath Uremia's distant peak. By defeating Mido's son in the system mission, Alpha collects a large chip payout, while Iota's evidence settles the political attack and restores peace to the Leonias domain. The victory triggers a wave of changes across the household. Beginning when the temple delegation prepares to depart, Costello shakes Sigma's hand and promises to report the Margrave's loyalty to the Emperor. Then the visiting priests and guards assemble for the return journey. Alpha notices Sheeta is still standing with the Leonias party and pauses in confusion. He bluntly asks why she has not left with the others, so the Imperial commander explains that Sheeta will remain at the estate under guard for a while. The arrangement is connected to her status as a saint candidate, though Sheeta apologizes because she cannot reveal every detail of the selection process. Alpha accepts the secrecy and wishes her luck, before another training session claims everyone's attention. Aoro has been folded into the Margrave's army as an ordinary recruit, apparently turning over a new leaf and loudly promising to train for future battles. Sigma's strict supervision makes clear the young noble receives no special treatment despite his family, while Aoro and Alpha awkwardly address each other with exaggerated respect. Aoro declares himself happy to be in the army and tries to act friendly, then praises Alpha's surprising ability until the servant dismisses his win as coincidence. The giant still insists they should get along and looks forward to another match. Just before a flying practice sword interrupts the new friendship, Alpha is dragged back into relentless drills, where most recruits spend their first year guarding walls and learning discipline. The Frontier Army carries heavier responsibilities, including monster patrols and defense across dangerous border regions, so every novice trains until their arms can barely lift wooden weapons. Veterans correct the struggling line with little mercy, while the red-haired first squad captain demonstrates the crushing standard expected of them. The strongest hitters in Sigma's forces can flatten ordinary trainees in seconds, and First Squad Captain Garm demands more courage from the exhausted recruits. Visconti attacks with speed Alpha can hardly track, forcing the servant to scramble through another desperate defense. Senior fighters can even stop wooden blades with bare hands, showing why these officers are trusted to command soldiers across the frontier. Visconti encourages Alpha when a technique finally works, and the servant begins studying every expert on the field as a potential teacher. Days fill with impacts, falls, and repeated corrections, each defeat hardening Alpha's body a little more. Garm demonstrates a devastating battlefield strike powerful enough to overwhelm almost any ordinary recruit, while Vice Commander Claude adds disciplined fundamentals, precise footwork, and brutally efficient counterattacks. Watching those monsters train, Alpha realizes everyone is fortunate to have Sigma setting their standard. Just as the Margrave personally enters a spar against all three of his senior officers, the visiting Imperial commander studies the unusual match with intense professional interest, while Sigma calmly intercepts the first coordinated assault before their formation can surround him. He drives the powerful Garm backward with a single exchange, then pivots immediately to meet Visconti's blade arriving from the opposite angle. Claude attacks at that same instant, exploiting the tiny opening between Sigma's movements, and forces the Margrave to navigate their practiced three-man formation without a moment's pause. The officers surround their lord and strike in disciplined sequence from every available direction, but Sigma glides through their weapons like the entire fight is merely his morning warm-up. Even Aero can only stare at the enormous difference between this level and his own, as Claude becomes the first elite officer thrown hard against the training ground. Visconti commits to one final attack while Garm tries closing from the other side, only for Sigma Stritra to neutralize the strike and turn on the red-haired captain immediately. Garm is hurled aside despite his massive frame and formidable battlefield experience, leaving Visconti frozen in disbelief as Sigma remains completely composed before them. Within moments, all three elite officers lie defeated around the lord they challenged, and the astonished observer finally calls the match before Sigma can continue his unreasonable training session. 1 month later, Uremia's foothills look completely different, as organized groups of pilgrims arrive beneath Leonia's protection. The new route from the imperial capital spreads rapidly by word of mouth and restores life to the domain, drawing families who pray for Mercury's blessing and safe futures. Guides cheerfully led exhausted travelers through the final stretch until they reach the grand temple built near the sacred mountain. Market stalls now line the pilgrimage square, where local merchants welcome visitors instead of exploiting them. Fresh meat, bread, and regional food sell quickly, while Alpha walks through the lively market to inspect his project. He asks one older vendor how business is going, and the man says sales are excellent thanks to the new visitors. Hungry pilgrims crowd every stall after the long path and happily for hearty local food, while positive reviews spread news of the old man's specialties. Even the state's horses are maintained through fees paid by visiting groups, and small iron medals become popular souvenirs tied to the journey. Pilgrims buy them as lifelong proof that they completed a once-in-a-lifetime visit, leaving transport labor as the only major burden for local sellers. The merchants gladly haul full loads uphill when every empty return trip means happy customers and real income, making the entire operation a win for visitors, residents, and the territory. Alpha admits he never cared about corporate slogans like win-win in his old life, but this result feels right, and the vendor celebrates their shared success without hesitation. Warm wind crosses the mountain as Alpha watches the thriving route, though his thoughts return to the future once he is alone that night. The prophetic history says Sigma will become a famed imperial commander but die at 33 without marrying, ending the Leonius bloodline, because absolute loyalty to the throne and endless war leave no room for a family of his own. Alpha figures some god might eventually drop a wife into Sigma's path if every other ambition succeeds. But matchmaking is hardly the immediate threat keeping him awake. The book predicts the Empire's destruction within 3 years and describes the rival powers that will tear it apart, giving Alpha names, future movements, and a terrifying outline of the coming conflict. Rumors already mention minor skirmishes on the western border, which may mean war is beginning earlier than the record led him to expect. Knowing this future makes running away feel irresponsible when Sigma and the household could be abandoned on the battlefield, and Alpha finds himself thinking about every person who has treated him like family. He closes the book, realizing that worrying from bed will solve exactly nothing. Alpha rises with a decision, telling himself it may be time to leave the servant role behind. He chooses to become a soldier and focus fully on combat so he can protect the domain, then returns to training, following instructions to swing in a half moon and bring the blade down through the center line. Visconti corrects the next movement and tells him to lower his posture, while another expert demonstrates wrist control and how to use the tip of the sword. The lesson becomes a rapid practical drill, sending a wooden blade past Alpha's face closely enough to reset his heartbeat. His instructor shows exactly how the motion should look, as she attends to another trainee who took the demonstration much less gracefully. She praises the improvement and makes Alpha wonder how much progress is possible under experienced fighters, since he still considers himself an amateur surrounded by veterans. The Imperial commander rejects that humility, saying Alpha's unusual techniques already help trained knights broaden their understanding, though Alpha insists he should be the one honored to practice beside real professionals. The commander remarks that genuine talent can be surprisingly difficult to recognize from the inside, and suggests exchanging instruction because solitary training has limits even for elite soldiers. Alpha worries Sigma might object to outsiders sharing techniques, but Sheeta says the Margrave is far too open-minded to refuse a useful exchange. She tells him to ask directly, while the commander returns to the yard under the watching household staff. Sigma, Iota, Garm, and Claude are already discussing the troops, and Sheeta notes that everyone in the Leonius domain seems able to work freely beneath such an informal lord. Alpha credits head butler Iota with handling most daily management, expertly balancing strict discipline with enough flexibility to keep the entire estate functioning. The villagers, knights, and Sigma all know how much they rely on him, and Sheeta confirms Alpha means Iota just as the chamberlain's voice carries across the yard. Alpha looks up. Hearing his name called from the officers' group, he tells Sheeta he is coming, then insists he is not remotely as dependable as the people they were discussing. Sheeta watches him hurry away, while Alpha privately reminds himself he cannot remain here forever and plans to leave the next night. Iota asks whether he knows the difference between a servant and a squire, explaining that their daily duties may overlap while their official status does not. A squire belongs to the warrior class and serves a master in preparation for knighthood, whereas an attendant handles ordinary chores, and battlefield achievement can eventually turn the former into a recognized noble knight. Advancement depends on accomplishments and acknowledgement from a proper lord, which puts Alpha in a terrible position because he was planning to run while Sigma is considering his future. Iota announces that Alpha's recommendations and proven skill have earned him promotion to squire, but Alpha bows deeply and declines despite his gratitude. The officers demand to know what he is saying, so Alpha apologizes and claims he lacks the ability and heart needed for the appointment. Sigma silently studies him while Iota asks for the real reason behind the refusal. Alpha admits he never expected to stay with the household long-term and wonders why the decision hurts this badly. As Claude says, he thought they had finally found someone who supported Sigma without selfish motives. The accusation lands harder than Alpha expects, and he explodes that nobody asked his opinion before assigning him responsibility for their reckless lord. How is one servant supposed to support a man willing to sacrifice everything, especially if promotion only makes leaving harder? Iota tries to calm him, but Alpha demands to know who else will stop Sigma when none of them can call the Count an altruistic idiot to his face. The surrounding recruits freeze at the outburst, as Alpha points at the Margrave and recalls how easily Sigma nearly threw away his title and territory. He asks who will stop the man next time, and Iota quietly answers that Alpha himself already has. Claude says that instinct matters far more than polished praise, while the other officers admit no precise skill list could replace such loyalty. Nobody invited Alpha because he was already perfect. They invited him because he is willing to challenge the household for its own sake. And Alpha breaks down asking who else could possibly do the job. Sheeta calls his name from behind, while he wipes furiously at tears that keep coming. Alpha slams one hand to the ground and swears before Sigma Leonius that he will try, drawing the Count's full attention. He demands one promise in return. Sigma must never surrender his title and people so recklessly again. Alpha demands that Sigma swear never to abandon the frontierland or the people depending on him, even inviting execution for his insubordination if the Count requires payment for such outrageous language. Sheeta and the visiting commander watch with tears gathering in their eyes, as Alpha insists Sigma must answer to every knight and citizen who freely chose to support him. The Count's perfect composure finally cracks beneath the sincerity of that reckless demand, while Iota wonders how one former servant has shaken their entire household so completely. Instead of punishing him, Sigma draws his sword and solemnly offers his word, lowering the blade before Alpha as the beginning of a formal warrior's pledge. Dark power surges around the Margrave, making the oath feel dangerously absolute. And Iota panics because addressing a lord without title while demanding submission normally means death. Alpha suddenly remembers that inconvenient social rule and realizes just how far he crossed the line. But Claude steps beside the frightened squire candidate instead of placing him under arrest. The vice commander recognizes Sigma's answer with quiet respect and draws his own weapon, kneeling before his lord with the sword lowered to join the newly spoken pledge. A heavy hand suddenly slaps Alpha forward before he can process the change, revealing a broadly grinning Garm already eager to make the promise official. The red-haired captain joins the oath with his usual explosive enthusiasm, while Visconti ruffles Alpha's hair like the former servant has finally entered their brotherhood. The veteran knight even flashes an approving hand sign toward their stunned new member, as recruits and officers close around Alpha and welcome him into the formation. Even Aro lifts Alpha completely off the ground as the soldiers celebrate their shared commitment, before the full formation turns and bows together beneath the waiting Margrave. Sigma Leonius raises his blade and swears a binding promise before every knight present, pledging to share their fate, defend the domain, and stake his own life beside theirs. The soldiers answer by raising their swords and offering their loyalty without reservation, promising themselves forever to the sovereign who has finally accepted their devotion. Alpha stands awkwardly at the center of the grand oath he accidentally created, until Visconti asks what promise their loudest instigator intends to make in return. With every knight watching, Alpha stalls and discovers there is nowhere left to run, then finally accepts the position beside Sigma and agrees to become his official squire. The entire assembled army bows in approval of the unexpected appointment, while Sigma seals their new bond by lowering his sword before Alpha. The former servant promises to devote everything he possesses to supporting his master, and later history remembers this strange ceremony as the birth of something genuinely legendary. The frontier knights, eventually celebrated as the Empire's strongest force, emerge from that shared vow. Although Alpha's first days as an official squire prove considerably less dramatic, he soon sits alone in a tiny boat fishing across the deceptively peaceful Lake Balza, using the science to decide what he can actually accomplish after pledging himself to Sigma. His goals sound simple: win the coming war, strengthen Sigma politically, and rebuild the frontier military, even though preventing the Empire's recorded destruction within 3 years still feels almost impossible. A sudden, powerful bite jerks the fishing line hard enough to pull Alpha forward, and he realizes that something much larger than expected has swallowed his bait. Remembering that every 1,000-mile journey begins with one step, Alpha chooses to accumulate smaller victories, even while the hooked creature drags his tiny wooden boat at speed across the lake. A remarkably massive fish finally bursts from the water at the end of his line, and Alpha swears he will overturn the destruction predicted 3 years ahead in the prophetic book. He celebrates the impressive catch and declares Lake Balza an unexpectedly fantastic fishing spot, until an urgent but distant warning from someone on shore interrupts his victory. The lakeside man waves both arms frantically and points somewhere beyond the boat. But Alpha misunderstands completely, proudly shouting back that he caught a really big fish. The increasingly desperate stranger keeps yelling and pointing behind him, making Alpha finally stop celebrating and ask what the man is actually trying to say. The terrifying answer waits directly behind his vulnerable little fishing boat, where a towering wall of displaced water rises from the lake without warning. That enormous wave swallows Alpha, his prized catch, and the entire boat together, blasting shattered boards and fishing equipment across the suddenly violent water. He eventually washes ashore, coughing and wondering what could possibly have attacked him, then learns Lake Balza contains a guardian magical beast that locals wisely avoid provoking. The creature rarely approaches land, meaning Alpha was extraordinarily lucky to survive instead of becoming lunch, though the mansion staff finds absolutely nothing amusing about their reckless new squire's story. Iota asks how a territory inspection somehow turned into swimming fully clothed, while a soaked, shivering Alpha apologizes for being an idiot. The Chamberlain orders him to change before catching cold and sends him back inside the estate. Alpha later rests in his room when a knock announces another visitor. Sheeta arrives with a wildly distorted rumor claiming he flew from a fish's mouth and was skewered by his own fishing rod, then says everyone was worried and is relieved he survived. She points out that Alpha still handles stable work, night training, territorial inspections, and squire duties all at once, but he says sword practice, tourism, finances, and development all matter too much to abandon. Stable work stays because he genuinely likes it, an answer that leaves Sheeta quietly impressed. Alpha accepts that the workload cannot be helped before showing her what he actually plans to do with Lake Balza. His tourist destination proposal includes a lake road, harbor, restaurant, swimming area, fishing spots, and eventually a commercial fisheries, but one enormous obstacle still controls every part of the project. Alpha admits the next step feels like a dangerously large gamble, then interrupts himself with a sneeze. Sheeta worries he really did catch cold, but Alpha returns to the Guardian problem, explaining that even Sigma's knights cannot defeat a beast capable of escaping and attacking beneath the water. Sheeta suggests abandoning the plan rather than gambling other people's lives against a troublesome magical fish. But Alpha says he will draw the creature onto land and handle the danger alone if necessary. His fever suddenly surges, and he collapses backward before Sheeta can finish arguing. Alpha lies burning in bed, while Iota explains that the high fever has lasted 3 days and refuses to respond to medicine or ordinary healing. The delirious patient promises to return to work tomorrow, so Iota calls him an idiot and bans all duties until recovery, then asks Sheeta to remain beside the room in case his condition changes. She realizes the illness may come from contact with the Lake Guardian, whose magical poison can infect anyone caught in its water. Alpha's exceptional stamina may be suppressing every symptom except the fever, but Iota says they will seek Archbishop Costello if there is any chance the illness could spread. Sheeta takes the warning seriously and promises to call for help if Alpha worsens. Elsewhere, Sigma's officers discuss the Lake Balza project, acknowledging that one mistake against its guardian could produce heavy casualties. The beast has lived there for a long time, yet the army commander sees no alternative except preparing carefully and fighting it, since ignoring the problem may prompt Sigma to attack alone, and no retainer wants that disaster. Back in bed, Alpha suffers through another wave of heat, wondering what is happening inside his body. It feels as though something has spent the entire fever running wild through him, pouring out more energy than he can control. Alpha tries to grasp the sensation like one of the system's powers. Refusing to stay trapped in bed forever, he compresses the energy, gives it shape, and aims the gathered force away from himself, telling his burning body that it can rest after one final effort. Alpha refuses to lose against a fever, and the concentrated heat erupts in a flash of red light. Morning returns over the estate, where Alpha awakens completely clear-headed and finds a tiny, flaming creature beside him. The red, rabbit-like being stares back from the blankets, leaving Alpha to ask what in the world it is. It resembles nothing he knows, though its body is definitely made of fire, and Alpha wonders whether he accidentally summoned it while forcing the fever out. A memory from his history book clicks into place, describing spirits born where elemental energy gathers, including rare intelligent forms that protect land or assist humans. Alpha asks whether his visitor is a fire spirit created from the fever, then requests demonstration of its magic. The creature produces a clean little flame, and Alpha enthusiastically praises his new living lighter. A sudden knock interrupts Alpha's discovery before he can properly examine the mysterious fire spirit. As Sheeta enters his room and demands to know why her patient is already awake, Alpha assures her the magical fever has completely vanished and turns to reveal his visitor, but the tiny creature disappears so quickly that Sheeta never catches sight of it. He searches the entire room while Sheeta repeats the frightening rumors surrounding his illness, and later tracks the elusive fire spirit outside among the estate's trees. Alpha asks whether the strange little creature has somehow been living inside his body, even wondering if he accidentally swallowed it during the Guardian's attack on Lake Balza. A better explanation is that the spirit formed from the magical fever itself. So Alpha decides to test exactly what kind of power his new companion possesses. He points toward a distant tree branch and asks the obedient spirit to burn it, while the rabbit-shaped flame carefully turns and lines itself up with the target. A compact but intensely bright fireball gathers between the little spirit's ears, shoots across the clearing, and strikes the selected branch directly in its center. Alpha calls the successful result pretty decent for their first deliberate test, although the distant smoking target demonstrates much greater range than he expected. Its accuracy barely changes over distance, making this living flame an impressive magical partner. And Alpha immediately wonders what might happen if its fire combines with his wind magic. He selects another leafy branch farther across the clearing as their next target, then activates first-level aerial spin and creates a controlled vortex in front of them. Alpha instructs the spirit to launch one fireball directly into the spinning current, but his overeager little partner jumps bodily into the dangerous vortex instead. Fire and compressed air merge violently around the tiny creature's spinning body, transforming the innocent-looking rabbit into a blazing projectile surrounded by spiraling wind. It rockets past Alpha's startled face before he can possibly cancel the test, and the rotating flames expand outward with terrifying speed and almost no control. A towering fire tornado erupts through the clearing and engulfs the nearby vegetation, leaving Alpha horrified by the scale of their completely accidental combination attack. Trees ignite throughout a widening circle as the spirit continues racing around, while Alpha chases it desperately and demands to know what the little maniac was thinking. He realizes that damage this spectacular cannot possibly remain hidden from observant Iota, but still hugs the menace because their new wind and fire synergy is undeniably powerful. Alpha gives his unexpectedly destructive companion the short, appropriately dramatic name Ace, and decides that nobody else can learn about the fire spirit's existence for now. Far across Lake Balza, several ordinary birds circle peacefully above the deceptively quiet water, until a much larger red-winged predator folds its wings and dives toward the surface. Its pointed beak nearly touches the lake as the creature closes upon its prey, when an enormous wall of displaced water suddenly explodes upward directly beneath it. The hidden guardian attacks from below and drags the airborne predator into the depths, leaving one solitary glowing eye beneath the surface to watch for the next disturbance. Back at the estate, Alpha realizes that conquering Lake Balza requires more than raw power, because the vast operation demands trained soldiers and cooperation from residents already living around it. While returning outside, he reduces the problem to 3 practical conditions for lasting victory. First, lure the Lake Master close enough to shore, since waiting for chance encounters is impossible. Second, prevent the creature from escaping into deep water, where even knights cannot pursue effectively. And third, finish it immediately, because any wounded monster would endanger every lakeside settlement. Alpha calls their greatest problems, yet the missing cooperation of local fishermen troubles him most. Residents explain they fish only near shore at night and otherwise avoid the dangerous lake, while sightings of its master remain rare and scattered, leaving no reliable pattern to exploit. Alpha understands why Sigma's knights have failed repeatedly, then Ace suddenly notices something ahead, prompting Alpha to follow the little spirit's gaze toward a commotion on the lakeside dock. There, several fishermen crowd around a wrecked boat while an enraged elder confronts them, screaming at Gaston for shattering yet another vessel and demanding compensation for the damage. The powerful fisherman Gaston refuses, threatening to crush anyone who keeps pestering him about payment, until Alpha steps forward and calmly declares that destroying someone else's property is plainly wrong. Gaston grabs the unfamiliar servant, sneering that no noble ever dared interfere with his business, and raises a thick club, promising to smash Alpha into pieces for challenging his authority. Alpha remains composed because Iota and an armed escort are already approaching the disturbance. But Iota's simple question out about the commotion instantly makes the raging fisherman freeze. Terrified, Gaston releases Alpha and protests that he merely disciplined workers who disobeyed his orders, attempting to disguise his intimidation as legitimate authority over the fishermen serving him. His followers mock the frightened elder, believing Gaston has escaped consequences once again. So Gaston resumes shouting, proclaiming himself the lake's master and condemning everyone's disrespect. He boasts that even passing merchant ships pay him protection whenever they enter Lake Balza, but the crowd suddenly stiffens as an overwhelmingly powerful presence arrives behind the bully. Gaston turns and finds a formal blue uniform looming there, decorated with unmistakable golden epaulets. As Sigma Leonia steps forward, silent and severe beneath an aura of lethal authority. One glance from the Frontier Lord crushes Gaston's bravado and drains the color from his face, leaving him stammering, "My lord," while sweat pours down his terrified expression. Sigma announces that beheading is too generous, making Alpha panic at another excessive punishment. Yet the Count's cold stare shows that exploitation within his territory will never be tolerated. Sigma marches the humbled fisherman away with Alpha and Iota following close behind, until Iota formally identifies the captive as Gaston, leader of the fishermen around Lake Balza. Gaston nervously asks why everyone is gathered, still uncertain what judgment awaits him, and Iota explains that their lord has decided to subjugate the monster ruling the lake. Horrified, Gaston calls the plan ridiculous and begs Sigma not to lend Alpha any assistance, insisting he opposes it because nobody should even contemplate challenging that terrifying creature. Iota excuses himself and walks away, leaving Alpha to deal directly with the stubborn leader, while Alpha confirms their acquaintance and recognizes Gaston as the key to local cooperation. Gaston retreats alone down the road, but his resistance only sharpens Alpha's determination to recruit him. The next morning, mist hangs above the quiet shoreline as fishing work begins before sunrise, and Alpha watches Gaston's crew spread along the beach, preparing boats, baskets, and heavy nets. Gaston personally casts with impressive strength, sweeping an enormous net across the shallow water, then inspects a healthy catch while Alpha approaches him without mentioning yesterday's confrontation. Alpha praises the size of one fish, surprising Gaston with his sincere curiosity, though the veteran fisherman answers with guarded silence and continues repairing his net. He eventually admits Lake Balls' fish during this season because nutrient-rich mountain streams feed everything here, from ordinary fish to birds and magical beasts. Alpha immediately concludes that the same abundance allowed the lake master to become monstrously huge and settles beside Gaston, carefully turning casual conversation toward first-hand knowledge of the creature. When asked whether he has seen it, Gaston recalls a recent solitary fishing trip, describing how an unseen force suddenly struck beneath his boat and nearly threw him into the water. He calls himself an idiot for sailing alone, where no companions could rescue him, and insists he never realized such a monster occupied the lake until that terrifying encounter. Gaston then scolds Alpha's poor manners, reminding him that he serves the lord of this territory. So Alpha introduces himself properly, apologizes for his upbringing, and promises not to embarrass his Sigma again. He privately realizes that every careless action can damage House Leonius's reputation, while Gaston accepts the apology and says he will remember Alpha's unexpected respectful response. The fisherman calls him strange, yet the hostility between them has noticeably begun to soften, and the two return to work together, agreeing to leave the dispute behind for now. As sunrise approaches, Alpha asks whether they have finished, but Gaston explains the master soon awakens, prompting Alpha to demand whether Gaston actually knows when the creature appears. Gaston cannot identify an exact location, though sightings repeatedly occur nearby around this hour, and he knocks Alpha's head for underestimating how carefully fishermen study their deadly surroundings. Gaston indignantly rejects the suggestion that his warning was meaningless or merely invented, while Alpha rubs the swelling and mutters that this stubborn old man hits absurdly hard. That evening, Alpha visits Gaston's modest wooden home to continue building their unlikely connection, where the fisherman welcomes him at a rough table and prepares food beneath warm lamplight. Alpha pours generous drinks, jokingly apologizing whenever his guest's cup threatens to empty, then reveals a gift instead of pressing Gaston immediately for help with the hunt. It is rare liquor Alpha secretly acquired, a luxury strong enough to brighten Gaston's suspicious expression, though Gaston asks whether such generosity truly comes without some calculated demand in return. Laughter soon fills the little house as drink loosens the tension between servant and fisherman, and Gaston warns that recklessly criticizing Sigma could still cost Alpha his head. Alpha grumbles that everyone employing an oddball like himself must be equally strange, including their lord. But Gaston invites the young man to explain what makes Sigma worthy of such loyalty. Alpha repeats Sigma's declaration that every person in his domain belongs to his family, and Gaston pauses over his drink, visibly affected despite trying to conceal his reaction. He asks whether those words came directly from Iota, testing if Alpha truly understands their weight. And Alpha quietly confirms it, allowing Sigma's conviction to speak more powerfully than any bargain. 3 years earlier, Sigma received a report concerning a previous attempt to conquer Lake Balza, after Imperial forces abandoned the monster while suppressing dangerous creatures elsewhere across the Empire. The knight assigned to investigate the lake and organize its subjugation was named Christophov, and he spent considerable time among the fishermen identifying the master's likely location and schedule. Christoph was approachable despite his rank, earning the entire community's trust through genuine friendship. While he and Gaston grew especially close, sharing drinks and boasting like lifelong companions. Their careful analysis produced a workable plan, making victory appear possible without reckless sacrifice. So Christophe joined Gaston on the water to complete the final stage of preparation. Unfortunately, their little boat sailed directly above the master before either man could react, and the colossal beast erupted from the lake, opening jaws large enough to swallow them whole. Christophe shoved Gaston away and met the attack himself, choosing his friend's life over his own, while the helpless fisherman watched blood scatter across the spray and screamed Christophe's name. The lake swallowed everything, and search parties never recovered the courageous knight's body, causing officials to abandon the mission after judging the danger and likely casualties unacceptable. Years later, Gaston still drinks beneath the crushing weight of that survivor's guilt, explaining that Christophe's sacrifice finally taught everyone what opposing the lake master truly costs. He begs Alpha to stop the new hunt, since House Leonius had already left the monster alone, and cannot understand why anyone would revive this deadly plan after so much time. Alpha answers that Sigma is serious because restoring the lake would protect residents and revive development. But Gaston lashes out, declaring that he never asked his lord to risk lives for him. Alpha nevertheless asks the old fisherman to lend them his strength for Christophe's sake, prompting Gaston to reject him angrily and insist that persuasion will never change his answer. He calls Alpha delusional for believing victory can be guaranteed against such an overwhelming beast, then dismisses promises of future prosperity because none matter if more people die achieving them. Alpha takes away his liquor and demands whether Christophe ever told him to surrender forever, warning that revenge cannot resurrect the dead even if they somehow destroy the monster. Gaston tearfully explains that Christophe protected an ordinary old fisherman at the cost of everything, and Alpha finally recognizes that preventing another sacrifice, not cowardice, drives this bitter refusal. Gaston remembers Christophe's easy smile and his promises that everyone would return safely, wishing he could stop that friend again, though the past remains painfully impossible to change. What he truly wants is simple. No other person should die because of Lake Balza, and his voice breaks as he repeats that he cannot endure losing anyone else. Alpha realizes he cannot simply drag this wounded old man into another monster hunt, and briefly wonders whether he should abandon the entire operation rather than deepen Gaston's grief. At that moment, the bet chip system suddenly materializes before him with a new opportunity, issuing a gambling mission whose objective is to make Gaston join the Master Hunt. Alpha marvels at the timely intervention as the system offers several possible contests, including a coin toss, a boat race, and a fishing match with increasingly favorable rewards. He studies the choices, knowing he cannot cancel once the gamble officially begins, then stakes 10 chips on the fishing match, choosing the contest Gaston respects above all others. Alpha abruptly erupts into exaggerated wailing, startling Gaston out of his drunken misery, and insists that he understands perfectly how conflicted the grieving fisherman feels. However, Alpha refuses to leave empty-handed after Gaston drank his precious liquor without permission, arguing that endless debate will accomplish nothing, while neither stubborn man agrees to retreat. He produces a coin and proposes letting pure chance settle their disagreement once and for all, leaving Gaston bewildered by the sudden transformation from heartfelt persuasion to gambling. Alpha offers a simple choice between the crest and reverse sides of the copper coin, promising that victory will settle their obligations while defeat earns Gaston valuable compensation. Gaston suspiciously asks what Alpha intends to take, calling the setup far too convenient, but Alpha sweetens the wager with 3 bottles of the head butler's finest hidden liquor. Gaston snaps that this is not about booze, because the hunt concerns actual human lives, and accuses the young servant of being too immature to understand such consequences. Alpha counters that Sigma's knights will risk themselves regardless, just as Christophe once did, forcing Gaston to confront the fact that refusing cooperation cannot automatically protect them. Whatever happens, those knights will pursue their lord's command until the monster falls, no matter how many soldiers die while entering waters only Gaston's people truly know. Therefore, the fisherman has only 2 choices: help them survive or watch blindly from shore. And Alpha flips the coin before Gaston can escape that brutal truth. The old man tries requesting more time, but the spinning copper is already descending. While Alpha declares the outcome fixed and reminds Gaston that chance has chosen for them. The coin arcs high through the room, carrying both men's decisions within its rotation. Then Alpha snatches it and slams his covered hand against the table. He tells Gaston to brace himself and honor whatever result fate has delivered, as the fisherman hesitantly reaches toward the concealed coin, wishing he could alter it. Beneath Alpha's hand lies the embossed crest, unmistakably confirming Gaston's winning side, so Alpha cheerfully admits defeat and tells the old man that he has won. Gaston stares in disbelief, having expected manipulation rather than an honest loss, but Alpha promises to pay the liquor and obediently leave, since a wager must be honored. Gaston complains that everything worked out suspiciously conveniently for the young gambler, until Alpha smiles, tells him goodbye, and says the knights will handle the hunt alone. That implication stops Gaston, who realizes his absence will not prevent Sigma from proceeding, and he finally agrees to participate so he can ensure that nobody else dies. Alpha quietly departs after winning the cooperation he needed without technically winning the toss, leaving Gaston alone to accept both Christophe's memory and his own renewed responsibility. Preparations accelerate at Lake Balza, where laborers build piers and organize supplies along the shore, while Sigma, Alpha, Iota, and their commanders gather around a map for operational planning. Reinforced piers will provide stable positions from which soldiers can attack without entering deep water, but they still require bait and a vessel capable of drawing the master toward those positions. Alpha proposes guiding the creature through a carefully controlled route, supported by barriers and traps, and Iota notes that another specialist may solve the remaining obstacle in their strategy. Iota laughs at Alpha's constant ideas and wonders where the former servant keeps finding them, while commanders agree that baiting and locating the master remain their most urgent unsolved problems. Nearby stands a reinforced fishing apparatus built to withstand forces that would destroy ordinary equipment. Yet even their strongest trap becomes useless unless they can predict where the target will surface. They decide Alpha will cast bait from the designated boat once the location and timing are confirmed, although he privately wonders how often one life can collide with impossibly dangerous events. Iota recommends asking the territory's greatest expert for his opinion, drawing everyone's attention behind them, where Gaston arrives and immediately orders the kid to stop spouting reckless nonsense. He bows to Iota, admitting his shame and asking permission to lend his knowledge, because helping destroy the master offers him a chance to avenge Sir Christophe at last. Iota welcomes him enthusiastically, recognizing that their plan finally has the guide it desperately needs, while Alpha admits he hoped to provoke Gaston but never expected such wholehearted commitment. Even so, he would have respected the fisherman if grief had kept him away, because the coin toss was secretly designed to preserve Gaston's freedoms instead of controlling it. Alpha had glued 2 crest-bearing faces together, guaranteeing that Gaston could never lose, so the old man saw the crest regardless of how the deliberately rigged coin landed. Alpha's true wager was that Gaston would eventually choose to help through his own free will, Not that luck or contractual pressure would force a wounded survivor back into danger. The system recognizes that deeper gamble and rewards Alpha with 80 chips for completing the mission, just as Gaston reminds him not to forget those 3 bottles of the head butler's liquor. Iota grabs Alpha and demands how he discovered the secret stash, leaving him unable to confess theft. But Gaston moves the group onward, announcing that he has crucial information for everyone. Alpha escapes the interrogation only because the expedition immediately follows their new guide, who reveals that he has a promising lead on where the Lake Master regularly appears. The commanders exchange surprised looks, realizing the fishermen may have solved their largest uncertainty, and the entire planning party follows Gaston through dense greenery bordering Lake Balza. He stops on a raised bank and identifies the exact section of shoreline ahead, explaining that several mountain streams enter there, carrying nutrients that gather huge schools of fish. Berries also grow nearby, attracting deer, birds, and magical beasts searching for easy food, which allows the lake master to ambush concentrated prey whenever it approaches the water. Gaston especially indicates a rocky outcrop where he has watched animals disappear in a single gulp, and the isolated stone formation offers a clear landmark for positioning their trap. Alpha asks how Gaston located such a specific feeding ground, and the fisherman reveals daily patrols, producing a hand-drawn map covered with observations gathered from every stretch of shoreline. Several feeding sites are marked, but this particular location provides their strongest chance for an ambush, astonishing Iota because Gaston assembled the intelligence within only 3 days of joining them. Gaston vows that their combined strength will finally avenge Christophe and protect everyone remaining, then answers the commander's approval with a nervous but resolute smile. Alpha watches silently, satisfied that the fisherman now stands among them by personal choice. As the officers establish 3 operational bases and begin refining the complete attack strategy, Iota promises to analyze the remaining details and coordinate every unit supporting the operation, while Gaston confirms the creature should return to this feeding ground beneath the next full moon. On that moonlit night, the fisherman sharpens his blade and prepares to face his oldest nightmare. But first, the estate has 10 days to transform their elaborate strategy into reality. Iota oversees construction beside the water, knowing any serious delay could ruin their narrow opportunity. As workers raise the central interception platform where the monster will be contained, laborers carefully assemble towering wooden frameworks, ramps, pulleys, and reinforced support beams, while Alpha tightens bindings himself, ensuring every piece can withstand the coming impact. Through relentless teamwork, the enormous lakeside trap is completed before their deadline, and the decisive battle finally begins beneath the predicted full moon. Soldiers wait silently throughout the hidden structure as calm water reflects the pale light, with a bleeding sheep tethered atop the rocky feeding ground as their living bait. Mist drifts between the platform and shoreline, while every knight suppresses his breathing, and even the surrounding forest seems unnaturally still as inks gather above the water. The frightened animal continues calling, surrounded by additional food meant to strengthen the lure, until a widening ripple finally appears beside the rock and begins circling closer. The sheep bleats again as something enormous surges upward from the darkness below, revealing the lake master's mountainous silhouette in a violent eruption of black water. Its attack crashes over the bait, proving Gaston's prediction accurate and triggering the weighting mechanisms, while waves slam outward across the carefully prepared channels around the platform. The master emerges fully, a colossal green aquatic predator towering above the rocks, then charges through the wooden approach exactly where the planners intended to guide it. Reinforced stakes absorb its momentum and funnel the thrashing creature deeper into their containment zone. As Gaston roars the signal and warns every soldier that their true struggle has begun, armored teams race from cover toward the immense winches positioned around the structure, throwing their combined strength into cranks powerful enough to move the suspended barriers. More soldiers brace the gears and haul together while the frames groans under tremendous pressure. And officers scream for everyone to keep turning despite the monster's violent resistance. Forced between narrowing walls, the Lake Master swims directly beneath the waiting capture system. So the commander orders every net released before the creature can reverse course. Soldiers sever restraints and pull levers in perfect synchronization across the shoreline, dropping huge weighted nets from the overhead framework around their trapped target. The woven barriers crash into the water and wrap the monster beneath multiple overlapping layers, while teams on land haul the attached ropes toward anchor points with desperate force. Additional mechanisms lock the lines into place, tightening the enclosure from every direction, and bridge units lean backward together, preventing the beast from dragging them into the lake. At last, the containment net holds the master in the fortified pen beside shore, allowing Gaston and Alpha to watch their impossible plan survive its dangerous opening phase. Gaston praises the walkways, and Alpha orders the knights to attack while confinement lasts. But the enraged monster hurls itself against the enclosure, testing every rope and support simultaneously. Gaston warns that ordinary fishing tricks cannot control this creature, and Alpha agrees emphatically, because calling the nightmare before them a mere fish would be dangerously absurd. The master's pale armored body resembles a serpentine dragon, crowned by fins and crimson eyes, And Gaston confirms that this horrifying beast truly rules every depth of Lake Balza. One burning eye narrows upon the humans who dared imprison it beside the shore. Then a demon-like scream tears through the night and shakes the entire wooden fortress. Alpha, Gaston, and the commanders endure that pressure without abandoning their assigned positions. As Sigma strides into the battle, his presence steadying every knight beneath his command. The trapped monster coils within the central pen, while attack teams surround it from elevated platforms, and the lead officer raises his sword, commanding the first archers to fire. Bowstrings snap in unison as an entire rank releases arrows toward the exposed creature, filling the moonlit air with a disciplined barrage aimed at its head and upper body. Most shafts glance from armored scales, but repeated impacts force the master backward inside its enclosure, allowing spear units to step forward and launch heavier weapons at closer range. Their coordinated strikes pierce several softer gaps, finally drawing blood from the seemingly invincible beast. Yet pain only enrages it, causing the huge body to batter every side of the trap. Gaston and Alpha monitor from shore, searching for structural failures or unexpected movements, and acknowledge that the knight's attacks work, though nobody can lower his guard yet. The Lake Master suddenly lunges toward a soldier at the edge of its confinement, but another knight reacts instantly, leveling a crossbow directly at its approaching skull. The bolt strikes amid explosive spray, interrupting the charge before its jaws reach the platform, while Alpha recoils at how narrowly the frontline soldier escaped being devoured. Still raging, the monster drives its bulk into the nearest support and splinters heavy beams, threatening to tear open the barrier and spill onto the soldiers clustered around it. The blonde commander orders everyone to remain outside the nets and dive clear if endangered, while archers continue firing to cover the crews responsible for maintaining containment. Gaston's officer commands the winch team to keep cranking and pin the beast's head down, so exhausted soldiers force the machinery onward as ropes strain beneath the load. More missiles hammer the master's wounded face, deepening the cuts around its eyes and jaw, but the creature twists violently, using its immense neck to shake loose embedded weapons. The commander orders an immediate reposition, sending the next attack formation toward its exposed flank, where the monster's attention cannot follow every moving squad at once. Soldiers sprint between barricades and reload, exploiting the narrow window created by its thrashing, before the blonde officer calls for the second synchronized volley and releases with them. A dense storm of arrows slams into the master's flank, driving it against the opposite wall, and the frontline commander confirms that our concentrated attack has struck exactly as planned. He immediately signals the fire unit, whose archers launch its blazing arrows into the enclosure, covering the creature's face and armored ridges with spreading flame and smoke. Burning missiles continue raining from the elevated walkway while soldiers protect the strained barriers. Then the blonde commander raises her sword again and orders a third volley without hesitation. Flaming shafts plunge into the master's head, turning its wounded face into an inferno, and the burning creature collapses around the bait rock as severed coils drift behind it. Knights hold their positions above the blazing water, uncertain whether the enormous target is truly dead, while ranged units keep weapons trained upon the motionless body through waves of heat. Commanders cautiously approach the lower barricade, refusing to celebrate before confirming the kill, but the burning Lake Master abruptly drives its head through the nearest wall. One soldier asks whether they defeated it, even as the structure splinters around him, and the monster's crimson eye snaps open with renewed, murderous focus. Its tail sweeps through flame and water, forcing stunned defenders to scatter from the platform, before its armored skull smashes through another reinforced section at full force. Knights are hurled across collapsing walkways as the creature's scream overwhelms shouted commands, and one massive coil clears an entire squad from the battlefield in a single strike. The master rises vertically above the wreckage, revealing how little strength its wounds have removed, while the red-haired commander is knocked violently from his feet amid shattered boards. He struggles upright through blood and fallen soldiers, unable to restore their broken formation, as the monster's body blackens and splits with glowing red veins beneath its damaged scales. Its burned face twists into something even more demonic, eyes blazing through torn flesh. And another explosive surge demolishes the containment platform that had restrained it moments earlier. A surviving knight looks upward from the ground, dwarfed by the transformed creature's looming shadow, while scattered flames illuminate casualties across the ruined base and every planned escape route. Alpha asks why their attacks failed, but Gaston says the damage is already fatal, explaining that serpentant monsters possess terrifying vitality and can survive for days without decisive decapitation. Alpha wonders whether retreating would let it die naturally, and Gaston reluctantly agrees, so they split up to rescue survivors, with Gaston taking the opposite side of the wreckage. Nearby, the blonde commander crawls through rushing water, wounded and separated from her weapon, while another exhausted knight stumbles between flames, desperately searching for anyone still alive. He turns at a sudden sound and realizes the Lake Master's attention has fixed upon them, as blood streams from its mangled head and rage gathers behind its open jaws. The creature lunges down to devour the stranded soldiers before they can escape, but a dark-armored knight launches himself into its path at the final instant. The blonde commander follows with a diving strike, carving into the master's wounded face, then lands beside her injured comrade as broken planks rain across the platform. She orders him to take the vice commander and run, assuming responsibility for holding the beast back, while the lake master towers over her, radiating a suffocating black-red aura despite its mortal wounds. The commander grimly admits that their situation may truly be hopeless after all. But Alpha races toward the confrontation, unwilling to abandon Sigma's knights to certain death. He reaches the ruined battlefield with his hand poised to act in determination, overcoming fear, only to stop in stunned silence at the terrifying sight waiting directly ahead.